She was abandoned while pregnant, left for power, erased from a life she helped build. But years later, at a prestigious gala, he looked up and saw the son he never knew standing beside the woman he once discarded, now a world-renowned surgeon. What happened next left everyone speechless. Where are you watching from? We'd love to know. If you believe in stories that hit the heart, don't forget to subscribe and stay tuned for more life-changing journeys like this one. I still remember the sound of the test blinking. It was barely audible, just a soft beep, but it echoed in the silence like a siren. I had just come off a 16-hour shift at St. Augustine's. My feet ached, my hands still smelled faintly of antiseptic despite 2 scrubs, and all I could think about was telling Andrew. We'd only been engaged 6 months, but we'd talked about kids since our second date. He said he loved the idea of building something more than just companies. A legacy, he called it once. I guess I never thought I'd be building it alone. I placed the test on the marble kitchen counter. 2 lines, bold and unrelenting, and waited for him. The penthouse was quiet, still soaked in the scent of cedar wood and whatever high-end cologne he used lately. I kept glancing at the door, rehearsing how I'd say it. I even imagined him dropping to one knee, again, this time promising the world not just to me, but to the life inside me. Silly, right? He walked in 15 minutes later, tie loosened, jacket slung over one shoulder like he had just conquered a country. But the moment he saw my face, he paused. His eyes darted from mine to the test on the counter. "Claire," he began, but his voice trailed off. "I'm pregnant," I said, voice steadier than I felt. "About 5 weeks." He didn't move. He didn't smile. He didn't even blink. He just set his jacket down carefully on the back of a chair and turned toward the window like he was avoiding some blinding light. After a long silence, I asked, "Say something." "We're moving to Singapore next month," he said. I blinked. "What?" "The board just approved the final phase of the merger. Prescott Zhang Global is relocating to Asia. I was going to tell you over dinner." I stared at him. "Andrew, I'm carrying your child." He sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "I know that's not ideal right now." "Not ideal?" I repeated. "You asked me to marry you 6 months ago. You told me we were building a life. You made me believe." "Plans change," he said coldly. "There's a lot riding on this, Claire. It's not just a move, it's my entire career. The merger includes the Zhang investment portfolio. Marrying Lillian is part of the deal." I felt my knees weaken, my hands shooting out to the edge of the counter to keep from crumbling. "Lillian Zhang? Your investor's daughter? You're marrying her?" His silence confirmed what I already knew. "How long?" I asked, my voice dropping to a whisper. "How long has this been going on?" "It's not personal," he said, his eyes finally meeting mine. "It's business. Strategic alignment." I laughed then, sharp and bitter. "I'm carrying your child and you're talking about alignment?" "I'll take care of everything," he replied. "The penthouse is yours. I've already instructed legal to transfer your accounts. You won't need to work if you don't want to." The briefcase snapped open, the sound cruel in its finality. He pulled out a folder, setting it on the counter like a contract had just closed. My future reduced to a set of contingencies and severance. I stepped forward, shoving the folder aside. "Look me in the eye and tell me that the last 3 years meant nothing to you." He hesitated. For the briefest moment, I thought I saw something flicker behind his eyes. Regret, maybe. But it vanished as quickly as it came. When he finally spoke, his words were lifeless. "I'm sorry, Claire." Then he walked away. He didn't touch me, didn't reach for my hand. He just opened the door and disappeared, the click of it shutting behind him louder than any slam. I stood there alone in that massive apartment we were supposed to raise a family in, the test still sitting on the counter, the evidence of a life now split in 2. My phone buzzed. "Vanessa." "How did he take the news?" I didn't reply. It buzzed again. "CNN Business Alert. Prescott Technologies confirms merger with Zhang Global. CEO Andrew Prescott to wed Lillian Zhang in private Singapore ceremony." I don't remember walking to the bathroom. I only remember the cold tile floor against my knees, the heaving, the way my hand clutched my stomach like I could shield the baby from what just happened. I splashed water on my face and stared at the mirror. My reflection didn't look back. It was someone else entirely, someone abandoned, humiliated, but still standing. I was Dr. Claire Morgan, a damn good surgeon, a dedicated researcher, A woman who had just lost everything, except the one thing that mattered most, my baby. I dried my face, picked up the test from the counter, and slipped it into my pocket. I had 12 hours left in my shift and a life to save. Mine could wait. The elevator ride down was silent. At the hospital, I clocked in like nothing happened, even though my heart felt like it had split open. In the trauma bay, I scrubbed in for surgery like muscle memory. No one knew. No one could know. I couldn't afford to break. Afterward, in a rare moment between back-to-back emergencies, I tried my ATM card just to see if I could buy coffee. Access denied. I tried again, then again. Third time, same result. He'd already shut everything down, every joint account, my personal savings, even the card for the penthouse. I wasn't just abandoned, I was erased. Vanessa found me leaning against the ATM like I'd been shot. She handed me coffee, took one look at me and said, "You're staying with me." "I can't." "You can. You will. And you'll be okay. You hear me?" I nodded, barely holding it together. Later that night, after I finished my shift and crawled into Vanessa's guest bed, I held my belly and whispered, "He made his choice. Now I make mine." I didn't know it yet, but in that moment, something inside me hardened. Not bitterness, not revenge, resolve. He could build his empire of glass. I would build something stronger, something real, a legacy he'd never be a part of. The morning after my shift, I walked into the bank lobby still wearing yesterday's scrubs. My body ached, my mind ran on fumes, and all I wanted was to withdraw $40 for groceries and maybe, if I let myself, something sweet to remind me life still had little joys. I slipped my card into the machine, punched in my PIN, and waited. Access denied. I blinked. Tried again. Access denied. My stomach tightened. Once more. Card blocked. Please contact your bank. The fluorescent lights above suddenly felt too bright. I could hear my own heartbeat thudding in my ears. I leaned my shoulder against the cold metal of the ATM as if it could keep me upright. My hand trembled as I reached for my phone. 3 notifications from the bank. 2 from the credit card company. 1 from the building's smart lock system. Your access to the following accounts has been terminated. Auto payment canceled. Digital key deactivated. Andrew hadn't just closed our joint accounts. He'd cut me off entirely. Even the apartment we'd shared, the one he said I could keep, was now sealed behind a system that no longer recognized me. I hadn't even had time to react when I heard Vanessa's voice behind me. "Claire?" I turned slowly. She stood there in jeans and a hoodie, holding 2 cups of coffee and staring at me like she already knew something was wrong. Her face changed when she saw mine. "I'm fine," I lied. "No, you're not." I swallowed, accepting one of the cups and trying to force a sip past the bile in my throat. He cleaned me out. Her eyes narrowed. "You can't touch your personal accounts." "Well," I muttered, holding up my phone and scrolling through the notifications. He did. And apparently his name was still on half of them. "That's illegal." I gave a bitter laugh. Funny how men like him don't care about what's legal when they know the system's on their side. Vanessa didn't say anything for a moment. Then she slipped her free hand around my shoulder and guided me gently away from the ATM. "Where did you sleep?" she asked. "On-call room," I said flatly. "Had an appendectomy crash in the middle of the night." "You're staying with me." No arguments. My roommate moved out last week. The spare room is clean, and my cousin's a financial lawyer who loves a good corporate screw-over. I couldn't hold it in any longer. Tears welled up and spilled over, hot and silent. "Vanessa, I can't. I don't even have a toothbrush." "We'll buy one." Along with a new bank account, a cheap mattress topper for that sad guest bed, and the biggest damn bottle of prenatal vitamins the pharmacy carries. She squeezed my shoulder. "You're not doing this alone." I tried to say thank you, but the words stuck in my throat. She hugged me tighter. "Don't you dare, just promise me one thing. Anything. When you're back on your feet, and you will be, we make him regret ever hearing your name." My phone buzzed again. A news alert. Prescott Technologies completes merger with Zhang Global. CEO Andrew Prescott weds Lillian Zhang in private Singapore ceremony. The headline blurred. I closed the screen and shoved the phone in my pocket. I didn't want revenge. Not then. Not really. I wanted air. I wanted silence. I wanted to stop feeling like I was the one who did something wrong. At Vanessa's apartment, I took my first real shower in 2 days. I stood under the hot spray with my hand over my belly, whispering apologies to the baby I hadn't even named. I whispered promises too, promises that sounded more like prayers. Later, I sat on the edge of Vanessa's guest bed while she handed me a peanut butter sandwich and a glass of water. She brought over a small stack of papers and set them down carefully. "What's this?" I asked. "Documentation," she said. "You're going to open a new bank account tomorrow. I already mapped out 3 branches within walking distance of the hospital." I stared at her. "And this," she added, handing me a business card, "is my cousin Elijah. He's discreet, ruthless, and gets a thrill out of going up against billionaires. I don't want to fight." "No," she said, leaning back, "but you do need protection. The law doesn't care if you made a promise. It cares about paper trails, leverage, and how fast you act." I nodded, chewing slowly. I was stupid. "No," she snapped, "you were in love. There's a difference. He was the one who made this a transaction. Now you make it a case study." That night, I lay in bed with a pillow tucked behind my back and the pregnancy test still on my nightstand. I stared at the ceiling and listened to the quiet hum of the city. Somewhere, I knew Andrew was sleeping soundly in some glass suite in Singapore, surrounded by people who thought he was a genius. Let them think it. I didn't need to change the world overnight, but I could take my first step in the morning. The next day, I opened a new account, transferred the little savings I had left from a side research stipend. Vanessa drove me to Target and helped me pick out sheets, toiletries, and a plain notebook that I later labeled the Rebuild Plan. We called Elijah over lunch. "I want to understand my rights," I said. He asked questions. He took notes. He offered no pity, only clarity. "You don't need to scream," he said as he slid a folder toward me. "You just need to outlive his noise." I liked that. It stuck with me. Over the next few weeks, I moved through my shifts like a ghost with a purpose. I stopped checking social media. I didn't open the messages from Andrew's mother. I ignored every email from his legal team offering financial maintenance. I wasn't here for hush money. I was here to survive. Then one night after a brutal emergency surgery on a 6-year-old with a collapsed lung, I sat in the locker room and pulled out my notebook. I flipped to a fresh page and wrote, "Goal, raise this child with dignity. Tactic, stay silent. Build slow, collect proof, be smarter." I stared at the words for a long time. They didn't feel like bitterness. They felt like armor. From then on, I took on every surgical case I could. I applied for a pediatric research grant I'd once thought too ambitious. I asked for help when I needed it and stopped apologizing when I couldn't do it all. I didn't tell my story to anyone who didn't earn it. I just lived. Quietly, intentionally. Because someday, someone was going to ask me, "How did you survive him?" And I wanted the answer to be this: I didn't survive him. I outgrew him. Vanessa once said healing didn't always begin with hope. Sometimes it began with strategy. And she was right. Because hope felt like a luxury, and strategy, well, that felt like survival. It started small. I began tracking Andrew's press releases, not out of spite, but precision. Every acquisition, every photo op, every sudden board reshuffle gave me another glimpse into the empire he was building atop the wreckage he left behind. I didn't want back in. I wanted to understand its foundations, because if I ever needed to tear it down for my child's future, I had to know where the cracks were. Vanessa's cousin Elijah became a quiet part of my days. He had the kind of dry wit that made legalese feel almost human. The first time we met in his office, he slid a folder toward me and said, "We're going to play chess, not checkers." Inside were shell company frameworks, investment vehicles that didn't tie back to me. "You'll own nothing in your name," he explained, "but everything in influence. Slow, consistent acquisition, penny stocks, split shares. By the time he realizes what's happened, you'll be holding more than just resentment." I stared at the stack of paperwork. "I'm not sure I want revenge." He smiled faintly. "It's not revenge. It's insurance. You're not fighting for the past, Claire. You're building leverage for your child's future." So I signed. Meanwhile, the hospital had no idea what was unraveling behind the scenes. They saw me as Dr. Morgan, the dedicated pediatric surgeon, calm under pressure who never missed a rotation. They praised my post-op reports, my follow-ups, my gentle way with parents. No one knew I reviewed surgical charts with one hand on my belly, or that morning sickness hit hardest between rounds. The baby grew, quiet and steady, like a promise forming beneath my ribs. I found small joy in weird places, like when Vanessa started mapping out baby names on a whiteboard, or when Elijah brought over tax strategies disguised as baby shower gifts. "You need a new health plan," he told me, handing over a packet. "Also, never accept checks for men in silk ties." I laughed more than I expected to. Grieved less than I thought I would. Not because it didn't hurt, but because the pain had found a rhythm. It pulsed in the background, steady as a drumbeat, reminding me of everything I still had to fight for. At night, I sat on Vanessa's balcony with my laptop and a mug of tea, studying financial articles I used to scroll past. I watched stock trends, read merger contracts, learned the language Andrew once used to dismiss me. There was power in understanding. One evening, I came across an op-ed praising Andrew's recent expansion into pediatric medical tech. It was packaged like philanthropy, but the core was profit. A flashy new research initiative that, ironically, mimicked a proposal I had once drafted back when he still asked my opinion. I stared at the screen, heart hammering. Then I pulled up my old files. The research was mine. Refined, yes. Branded, repackaged, but unmistakably rooted in the same core ideas I'd once shown him over wine and data printouts at our kitchen table. He hadn't just left me. He'd taken pieces of my mind with him. I closed the laptop slowly. My hands shook, but it wasn't fear this time. It was clarity. That night, I reopened my pediatric surgical proposal, a minimally invasive technique for correcting congenital heart defects in infants. I'd shelved it after the breakup, thinking I couldn't handle the scope alone. Now, I had every reason to. 2 weeks later, I submitted it. 3 months after that, I received the acceptance letter, full funding, my own research team, my name, Claire Morgan, MD, at the top of the grant. I stared at the letter like it might vanish if I blinked too hard. Vanessa found me frozen in the kitchen, the letter in one hand, a half-eaten slice of toast in the other. "You did it," she said softly, placing a hand on my shoulder. I nodded, eyes glassy. "They approved everything." She beamed. "While Andrew was marrying his investor, you were revolutionizing medicine." I taped that letter above my desk. That weekend, I bought a small notebook, the good kind, leather-bound ivory pages. I wrote one sentence on the first page: "This is not revenge. This is foundation." And beneath it, in smaller handwriting, "I will build a future for my child that cannot be touched by greed." In the months that followed, I began putting that future into motion. I directed surgeries, led morning rounds, filed financial moves through Elijah's firm, moved quietly, intentionally. Every share I bought in Prescott Jang Tech was another brick in my invisible wall. Andrew's name never passed my lips, but his shadow never left my mind. Then, out of nowhere, came the first package. It arrived in a simple brown box addressed to Dr. Claire Morgan. Inside were 3 children's books about biology, a rattle shaped like a stethoscope, and a card. "For the future doctor, with love, Margaret Prescott," his mother. I stood in the doorway holding the box like it might explode. I hadn't spoken to Margaret since before Andrew left. She was always kind to me, the kind of woman who wore silk gloves and understood both boardrooms and lullabies. I didn't know what to think. Was it guilt? A peace offering? I showed Vanessa the card. "She's not the enemy," Vanessa said cautiously, "but she's still in the game." I didn't reply, but I kept the books. Weeks passed. The belly grew. My balance shifted, my pace slowed, but my fire sharpened. I moved with purpose now. Every breath was laced with determination. Every decision tied back to one thing. My child would not live in the shadow of a man who saw people as pawns. And then one morning, around 2 a.m., I felt the first real kick. I was in the OR lounge, finishing a chart, when it happened. A flutter so precise it stopped me mid-sentence. I pressed my hand against the swell of my stomach and whispered, "I feel you." And in that moment, I knew. Whatever came next, I wouldn't do it alone. We were a team already. Me and this tiny, unshakable force of nature growing inside me. Andrew had built a company out of silence and secrets. I was building something better, heartbeat by heartbeat. The contraction hit just as I was closing the incision. It wasn't the first one that day, but it was the first that made my knees buckle just enough to notice. I steadied myself without flinching, my gloved hands still inside a newborn's chest cavity, guiding a delicate stitch between 2 arteries not much thicker than a strand of hair. "Dr. Morgan, your blood pressure is spiking," said Dr. Martinez from across the table. "I'm aware," I replied, voice even. "You're 39 weeks pregnant," he said, not unkindly, just concerned. "You shouldn't even be here." "I know exactly what I'm doing," I said, eyes on the monitors, "and I'm not leaving this table until this child's heart is beating properly." The room fell silent, except for the beeping of the monitors. I felt another wave ripple through my lower back, tighter, more insistent. But I didn't let it show. One more stitch, one more adjustment, and then normal sinus rhythm. A steady beep, calm and sure. The heart's stable, the anesthesiologist confirmed. I pulled my hands out slowly. "Close for me, Martinez. I think I'm in labor." He blinked. "You think?" Another contraction hit and I clutched the edge of the table, gritting my teeth. "I know I'm in labor." The next moments were a blur. Nurses calling out, a gurney rolling in, my scrub top being carefully cut away as I was eased down. My legs trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of everything crashing at once. Adrenaline, pain, awe. Vanessa appeared as if summoned by instinct, already snapping on gloves and barking orders. "Get OB up here, stat. Claire, keep breathing. I've got you." As they wheeled me through the halls, I clutched her hand and asked the one thing I couldn't let go of. "The baby I just operated on, how is she?" "She's stable," Vanessa said firmly. "You did it." Relief flooded me, even through the waves of labor. "Good, that's good." Then the world narrowed to pain. Real pain. Not metaphorical heartbreak or legal betrayal, but sharp, breathtaking, soul-twisting pain that had no end and no shape. 14 hours later, in a small, warm room with low lights and the faint scent of antiseptic, my son came into the world screaming with fury and lungs full of life. His cry cut through everything. It was the loudest sound I'd ever heard and the most beautiful. They placed him on my chest, slick and red and wiggling like he was already ready to take on the world. "He looks like him," I whispered, brushing a trembling finger along his tiny brow. "No," Vanessa said, gently adjusting his swaddle. "He looks like you, strong, stubborn, and already proving people wrong by being born in the OR." A soft knock at the door broke the stillness. A nurse entered with a massive bouquet of white lilies and soft blue hydrangeas. "These came for you, Dr. Morgan." I blinked. "From who?" She held up the card. "Margaret Prescott." Vanessa froze beside me. "How did she know you delivered?" I knew the answer even before the thought finished forming. Hospital gossip. Word traveled fast, especially when a surgeon gave birth minutes after saving another newborn's life. I looked down at my son. "She's still his grandmother," I said softly. "Whatever else she might be." The nurse placed the flowers on the windowsill. "She also sent a small plush bear, said it was Andrew's when he was a baby." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. My focus had shifted entirely. The boy in my arms blinked up at me with eyes too big for his face and a grip that felt determined already. "Hello," I whispered. "I've been waiting for you." Later, as Vanessa returned from checking on my post-op patient, she smiled. "Perfect recovery. The family's asking for you." I managed a small laugh. "Tell them Dr. Morgan is recovering from saving 2 lives in one night. They'll love that." I held my son tighter. "Do we have a name yet?" she asked, pulling a chair to my bedside. "I think so," I said, eyes still fixed on his face. "Benjamin. But I'm calling him Benji." "Benji Morgan?" Vanessa echoed. "Strong, classic, no last name tied to him?" "No, Prescott," I confirmed. "He gets my name, he gets my story." She nodded in silent agreement. My phone buzzed, a message from the hospital board congratulating me, along with a link to a local article already titled, "Surgeon Saves Infant, Then Gives Birth to Her Own." I ignored it. Then another message appeared, this one a news alert. "Prescott Jang Tech expands into pediatric robotics." I rolled my eyes. Of course. They were still chasing headlines while I was here, grounded in something real, something breathing and warm and irreplaceable. A few days later, as I packed up my things to take Benji home, a nurse came by with a clipboard and a wide smile. "You're cleared to go, Dr. Morgan. Just need to sign here. And congratulations, by the way. Everyone's been talking about you." I smiled politely, though all I wanted was a nap and a moment alone with my child that didn't involve charts or monitors. Vanessa loaded the car while I buckled Benji into his carrier. As I looked down at him, soft and blinking, I said softly, "We're going to be okay, you and me. I promise you." On the way out, we passed the surgical floor. Nurses waved, residents clapped. I kept my head high but didn't stop. I didn't need applause, I didn't want attention, I just wanted to get home. That night, in Vanessa's living room, I sat on the couch while Benji slept curled beside me, his little mouth open in a perfect O, his tiny fingers curled around the edge of my shirt. I stared at him for a long time. It wasn't just love. It was purpose. He was my reason now, my center, my unshakable truth. And as I looked out the window into the quiet city below, I whispered the words I hadn't been able to say since Andrew left. I'm not broken. I'm just getting started. 3 years passed. Benji had just turned 3, and with every passing month, he grew into something that astonished me. A little person with a mind so sharp it scared me sometimes. He was already asking questions about anatomy I didn't expect until high school. He could spell aorta before he could properly pronounce cookie. And he loved puzzles. Not the cartoonish ones made for toddlers, but the 100-piece ones, full of small, interlocking edges and impossible detail. One quiet Saturday morning, I watched him from across the room as he finished a dinosaur puzzle in less than 10 minutes. He looked up at me with the kind of pride that tugged deep at my chest. "I did it, Mommy," he beamed. "Yes, you did," I whispered, though my mind was elsewhere. Specifically on the speech I was finalizing for a medical conference in Baltimore next month, where I'd be presenting my new minimally invasive pediatric heart technique. Invitations had started arriving from around the country, even internationally. The world was finally paying attention to the work I'd quietly built from ashes. Vanessa was lounging on the couch, flipping through a medical journal while sipping her second espresso. "You know," she said without looking up, "most 3-year-olds are still trying to eat puzzle pieces." I smiled. "Benji's not most kids." As if on cue, the television in the background shifted to a business segment. The anchor's voice floated into the room. Rumors continued to swirl about the impending divorce of tech mogul Andrew Prescott and his wife, Lillian Zhang. Vanessa muted the volume before the image even had time to fade. But I had already seen it. Andrew's face, older, warier, still polished but hollow. The marriage had unraveled publicly. Stock prices had dipped, investors had started pulling out, and while the media speculated about betrayal or mismanagement, I knew the truth didn't need to be shouted. It was unfolding just as quietly as I had planned. "I'm fine," I told Vanessa, who was watching me now. She raised an eyebrow. "I heard about it last week," I added. "Margaret called." "You're taking her calls now?" I shrugged. "She sends Benji books, educational ones." Vanessa sat up straighter. "The shares?" 15%, I said quietly. "Another year, maybe 2. Then I'll hold enough voting power to matter." She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, "Claire, you already matter." Benji came over then, holding up a new box of puzzle pieces. "Can we do this one together, Mommy?" "In a bit," I promised. "I have to finish writing about tiny hearts." He nodded and went back to the floor, his curls bouncing with each step. Later that week, I received a formal invitation. Henderson Children's Hospital was awarding me the Innovation in Pediatric Surgery Award at their annual gala. It would be my first public red carpet, a televised event, and I debated bringing Benji. The committee hesitated when I asked, suggesting he might be a distraction from the gravitas of the award. But I insisted, because Benji wasn't a distraction. He was the reason. So on the night of the gala, I wore an emerald green gown that Vanessa helped pick out, elegant but strong. Benji walked beside me in a miniature tuxedo, clutching my hand with quiet excitement as cameras flashed around us. He looked like a prince and carried himself like one too, waving shyly at people who bent to greet him. Vanessa met us backstage, stunning in navy blue, her makeup more glamorous than I'd ever seen. "You two ready?" "Dr. Mommy and Dr. Benji reporting for duty," I joked, and Benji gave me a serious little nod. I spotted Andrew before I even stepped onto the stage. He was standing near the bar, still and pale, dressed in a gray tailored suit that didn't quite mask the wear of the last 3 years. Our eyes met. He didn't move. He didn't blink. But his mouth parted, just slightly, like he couldn't quite breathe. I turned away before he could speak. The MC's voice rang out. "Please welcome this year's recipient of the Innovation in Pediatric Surgery Award, Dr. Claire Morgan." The applause was thunderous. As I stepped onto the stage with Benji at my side, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, the satisfying weight of acknowledgement, not validation, but truth being seen. I began my speech. 3 years ago, I said, I realized something about tiny hearts. They're remarkably resilient. They grow, they heal, they adapt, and sometimes they teach us more about courage than any textbook ever could. I went on to speak about the new surgical techniques, the children whose lives had been saved, and the future we were building for them. But my eyes kept drifting to Benji, who was holding the crystal award with careful fingers, his face glowing with pride. And so, I said in closing, to all the tiny hearts I've helped heal, thank you. But the biggest thank you goes to my son, Benji, who reminded me that the strongest hearts aren't always the ones we operate on. Benji stepped forward just as rehearsed, standing on tiptoe to reach the microphone. "Congratulations, Dr. Mommy," he said, loud and clear. The audience melted. The standing ovation was instant. Later, as we sat at our table, Vanessa leaned over. "He's gone. I didn't have to ask who. Left after your speech." I nodded, watching Benji explain blood flow to the hospital's board chair using crayons and a napkin. "Seeing him must have." "Reminded him," I interrupted, "what he gave up." She raised her glass silently. Benji returned, breathless. "Dr. Wilson said I can visit the echo machine tomorrow." "Did you thank him properly?" "Yes," he said, then lowered his voice conspiratorially. "I also asked about mitral valve regurgitation like you taught me." I laughed softly, pulling him into my lap. He smelled like soap and sugar and the kind of joy I used to think I'd lost. Across the room, near the exit, I saw her, Margaret. She was standing beside the dedication plaque, tears in her eyes. She met my gaze, and for a moment, something passed between us. Not apology, not approval. Understanding. I gave her a small nod. She returned it, then disappeared into the night. Benji tugged at my sleeve. "Can we go see the fish tank again before we leave?" "Of course," I said, rising. Just as we reached the hallway, a nurse rushed toward us. "Dr. Morgan, emergency case incoming. Pediatric." Vanessa appeared instantly, already reaching for Benji. "Go," she said. "We'll handle the fish." I knelt, pressing a kiss to his forehead. "Be good for Aunt Vanessa." "Save the tiny heart, Mommy," he whispered. And just like that, I was back. Not on stage, not in the spotlight, in the place I belonged, saving lives, one tiny heart at a time. 3 days after the gala, I returned to work and found a white envelope waiting on my desk. It had no return address, but I recognized the stationery. Heavyweight, cream-colored, Prescott family seal pressed in wax. I didn't open it right away. I let it sit between patient files and surgical reports, pretending it didn't hum with history. Vanessa walked in mid-afternoon, holding her tablet like it was on fire. "You need to see this." She flipped it toward me. The headline stopped me cold. "Helen Jang Prescott files for divorce, cites irreconcilable differences and demands controlling interest in Prescott Technologies." I stared at the screen. Below the headline was a photo of Helen, looking polished and furious, striding into a courthouse with a team of lawyers behind her. "She's coming for him," Vanessa said. I leaned back in my chair. "She's not just coming for him, she's trying to replace him." My phone buzzed almost instantly. Unknown number. I didn't answer. Then the voicemail came in. "Helen. Dr. Morgan, we haven't spoken, but I believe our interests now align. I know about your shares, about your son. I'm not here to threaten you. I'm here to propose a partnership, one that benefits us both." I stared at the screen in silence, the echo of her voice still ringing in my ears. Before I could reply, my pager buzzed. Margaret, or rather, the oncology floor. When I arrived, Margaret looked different. Smaller, paler, and wrapped in hospital linens instead of tailored silk. She turned toward me slowly, her voice barely audible. "So it's time then," she murmured. "She called you." I didn't answer. I was too busy reading her chart. The labs told a story even Margaret hadn't voiced yet. "Stage 4?" I asked, eyes flicking toward her face. She nodded. "Pancreatic." I swallowed hard. "How long?" "Not long enough to waste on fiction," she said simply. I pulled up a chair beside her bed. "Lucas, he'll want to see you." "I know," she whispered. "That's why I'm here." There was so much I wanted to say, so much I could have accused her of, what she knew, what she allowed, what she didn't stop, but none of it mattered now. In her silence, she had done more for my son than his father ever had. "He doesn't know," Margaret continued, "about the cancer, about the shares, about the gifts, and he can't know." "Not yet." I nodded. "He'll fight you," she said, her eyes on mine. "Not because he wants Benji, but because he can't stand to lose." My jaw tightened. Then he should have thought of that before he walked away. A knock interrupted us. The nurse leaned in. "Dr. Morgan?" Helen Jang is on the line. She says it's urgent. Margaret's lips curved into a dry smile. Tell her you'll call back after you've reviewed the battlefield. I rose from the chair, but Margaret stopped me with a hand. He has James's mind, she whispered, nodding toward the hallway. But he has your heart. Thank God for that. As I left her room, my phone buzzed again. Text from Helen, board vote next week. We'll need you in Singapore, you and your shares. Let's finish this. I sat on the bench outside Margaret's room and exhaled. For 3 years, I had built my life brick by quiet brick. I had watched from the sidelines as Andrew climbed his throne, and now it was shaking. Elijah called the next morning. Your travel arrangements are confirmed. First-class ticket to Singapore. Boardroom access. Legal proxy in place. I hesitated. Do we have enough leverage? He laughed softly. You're holding 18% of the company, Claire, more than anyone else on that board, including him. That night, I told Benji the truth in pieces he could handle. Mommy has to go away for a few days, I said while tucking him in. He looked up at me, his eyes already so full of understanding. To help people? I smiled, something like that. Will Aunt Vanessa stay with me? She'll be with you every second. He nodded solemnly. Don't forget my robot heart model. I kissed his forehead. I never do. 2 days later, I stepped off the plane into the dense humidity of Singapore. A black car waited, sleek and silent. It drove me to a towering skyscraper bearing the Prescott Technologies logo, though if Helen had her way, that name wouldn't last much longer. The boardroom was glass and chrome and far too cold. Helen sat at the head, her posture razor sharp, her dress the color of ambition. Andrew sat at the far end, expression unreadable. Older now, tired, thinner. He didn't meet my eyes. Dr. Morgan, the chair announced, you now represent the largest single shareholder in the room. The floor is yours. I stood slowly and opened my laptop. One click, and the screen behind me lit up. A video played. Benji at his study desk explaining cardiac function to Margaret, his voice clear, his eyes bright, his mind unstoppable. This, I said, is Benjamin Morgan, IQ 164, my son, our son. Gasps erupted. Andrew went pale. I looked directly at him. He is the legacy you discarded, the future you left behind. I let the silence hang heavy, then continued. As the controlling shareholder, I vote in favor of restructuring. I support Helen Jang's proposal. Effective immediately, Andrew Prescott is removed as CEO. Papers shuffled, voices murmured. Andrew said nothing. As I packed up to leave, Helen called out, we should talk next steps. My lawyer will be in touch, I said, already heading for the elevator. I have a patient waiting. I flew back that night, but it wasn't fast enough. Margaret passed away an hour before I landed. Benji had been with her, holding her hand. Vanessa said she went peacefully. When I arrived at the hospital, Sarah handed me a sealed envelope. Inside, a letter and a USB drive. The letter was pure Margaret, elegant, meticulous, brutally honest. Dearest Claire, by now the board meeting is over. I hope you showed them what brilliance looks like. The drive contains everything Andrew tried to hide. Fraudulent merger contracts, backdated marriage records, insider trades. Use it if you must. Not for revenge, but to protect Benji. This is my last gift to him. And to you. Love him enough for all of us. Margaret, I clutched the paper to my chest, tears threatening. She hadn't just given Benji love. She had given him power. And Andrew? He hadn't just lost a company. He'd lost his shield. It wasn't about winning anymore. It was about legacy. And now that legacy belonged to my son. The next morning, the letter sat on my kitchen counter, unopened. Margaret's handwriting still looked poised and confident, even though her voice was gone forever. The envelope had arrived alongside another, thicker, hand-delivered by hospital security. This one was from James. Vanessa found me staring at both. Coffee untouched, Benji at the dining table carefully aligning a row of plastic heart valves. Which one's worse? She asked gently, nodding at the envelopes. I didn't answer. I opened Margaret's first. Inside was a second, smaller envelope marked for Benji, to be opened when he turns 18. And a bank document outlining a substantial trust fund in his name. Enough to pay for any education he wanted, enough to ensure he'd never be vulnerable to anyone's greed. Tucked in the back was a final note. Claire, I hope by now you understand that I always saw you, not just as the woman my son left, but as the mother my grandson needed. Thank you for staying kind when you had every reason not to. I held it in my lap and breathed for a while, quiet and steady. Then I opened James's. It was a letter. Long, rambling, full of phrases like, I didn't know, and if I could go back, and I'm not asking for forgiveness, only a chance. He included a photo of himself, unshaven, standing in front of what looked like a youth shelter somewhere in Manila. Scribbled on the back, helping where I can now. And another envelope labeled, for Benji, when he's older. I stared at it for a long time before sealing both in a fireproof box and writing the date, to be opened on Benji's 18th birthday. I wasn't going to let James rewrite the story just because he finally felt the consequences. Later that evening, as the sun dipped into the horizon, the living room was filled with the soft hum of Benji explaining cardiac pressure to a group of curious medical students. They were interns visiting from another city, and Benji, at 3 years old, was standing on a step stool in front of the whiteboard Vanessa had installed in our hallway. He's showing them the blood flow cycle, she whispered, filming from the doorway. I think one of them is actually taking notes. I laughed, because otherwise I'd cry. He was mine in every possible way. My features, my heart, my tenacity, the way he quietly dismantled rooms full of adults with facts and wonder. A week later, I got another call. Johns & Hopkins Medical Conference. They wanted me to headline the keynote address and present my research in front of the world's top pediatric cardiac surgeons. The same week, James was scheduled to receive a Lifetime Innovation Award from a nearby tech consortium. I nearly said no, but Benji overheard Vanessa talking about Baltimore and immediately asked, "Can we go to the aquarium too?" So I said yes. The night of the conference, I wore navy. Benji wore a miniature lab coat with his name embroidered on the chest, Dr. Benji Morgan. The audience lit up when we walked on stage together. No one questioned it anymore. The boy had earned his place beside me. My speech was smooth, measured, and sharp. I talked about saving lives, about the new microsurgical valve prototype, about lessons tiny hearts taught us, how they fight, heal, and find rhythm again after trauma. Benji handed me my award with a big grin, then leaned into the microphone and said, "My mommy fixes hearts, and I'm going to help." Laughter, applause, a few tears. Afterward at the reception, Vanessa nudged me. "He's here." I didn't need her to say his name. I already felt it. James stood at the back, not in a suit, not surrounded by press, just quietly watching from near the exit. When our eyes met, he didn't wave, didn't try to come closer. He simply nodded once, touched his hand to his chest, and walked away. Good. Let him find redemption elsewhere. My path, our path, was already set. When I bent to help Benji take off his coat, he whispered, "Did he see us?" "Yes." "Does he know who I am?" I paused. "He knows now. Is that okay?" I looked at my son. "It's not your job to fix the past, baby. You just keep building the future." He nodded seriously and ran back toward a group of interns still discussing heart chambers. The next morning, I met with our hospital director to finalize something Margaret had put in motion before she passed. When the ceremony began, I stood beside Benji as we unveiled the new name carved in granite, the Margaret Prescott Center for Pediatric Innovation. Benji was the one who pulled the silk cover down, and beneath the plaque, another name shimmered in smaller letters. Dr. Benjamin Morgan, youngest certified medical researcher in U.S. history. He looked up at me and whispered, "Can we start the trials today?" His pediatric heart valve, first drafted in crayon, then refined through months of work, had been approved for preclinical testing. At 9 years old, my son was leading the next revolution in child heart health. Reporters asked him how he did it. He smiled shyly and said, "I just asked my mommy a lot of questions." In the middle of it all, I noticed a figure standing near the back of the small crowd. James, older, smaller, quiet. He didn't speak. He didn't approach. But when the ceremony ended and people began to disperse, he walked up to the plaque, gently ran his fingers over his mother's name, and left a single white lily at its base. He didn't look at me. He didn't need to. Everything that needed to be said had already been lived. As I watched Benji return to his small workstation, already loading patient files into a research app on his tablet, I felt something deep inside me settle. Peace, maybe, or power, or both. He turned toward me and grinned. "Ready for your first case review, Dr. Mom?" he asked. I smiled, grabbing my white coat. "Always." And as we walked down the hall together, mother and son, both in white, I thought of everything it took to get here. Every betrayal, every setback, every quiet victory. Some choices echo forever. But sometimes, if we're lucky, those echoes become music. 9 years. That's how long it had been since I stood in that cold kitchen, staring at a blinking pregnancy test and listening to the sound of a door closing behind me. Now I stood in the heart of the Children's Cardiac Wing, newly renamed the Margaret Prescott Center for Pediatric Innovation, watching my son, Dr. Benjamin Morgan, adjust his miniature lab coat as cameras clicked and reporters whispered his name like he was a myth brought to life. He wasn't even 10. But he'd just been certified as the youngest medical researcher in U.S. history. And today, he would present his prototype, a pediatric heart valve designed for infants born with congenital defects, sketched at 7, refined at 8, and now approved for its first clinical trials at 9. I should have felt nervous. I should have been overwhelmed, but all I felt was pride so deep it made my chest ache. He looked over at me before stepping up to the podium, that quiet, knowing smile he'd had since he could barely speak. The same one that had reassured me through scraped knees, late-night coughs, and his first time correcting a resident on cardiac output. I gave him a small nod. He didn't need more. He began his presentation like he'd done it 100 times, with calm precision, clear terminology, and a touch of innocent brilliance that even the most seasoned cardiologists in the room couldn't fake. By the time he explained the polymer's resistance and its adaptive structure, the audience had forgotten he was under 4 feet tall. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. This was his moment. After the presentation, as the crowd swarmed around him, asking questions and posing for selfies, I stepped aside to breathe. And that's when I saw James. He was standing at the edge of the room, hands folded in front of him, wearing a rumpled shirt and a face that had aged more than a decade in half the time. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Our eyes met, and for a moment, the years between us collapsed. The man who had left me for a deal, who had traded a family for a merger, now stood in front of the legacy he could never claim. Benji didn't notice him. He was too busy explaining valve mechanics to a cluster of wide-eyed interns. James took a step forward, then stopped at the plaque bearing his mother's name. His hand lifted and lightly traced the engraved letters. Then he turned to go. He never looked at me again, and I didn't stop him, because what was there left to say? He had watched our son succeed from a distance, and I imagined every one of those moments carved a little deeper into whatever guilt remained. Let that be his penance. My path was no longer tangled with his. Later in the lab, I watched Benji slide into his chair and pull up a file on his tablet. The nurses had baked him a chocolate cake the night before, with Dr. Benji written in shaky frosting. The candles were still sitting on the counter. "You ready for your first official case review?" I asked, smiling. "Already downloaded the scans," he said, all business. "The patient has a malformed pulmonary valve. I think the prototype will fit, just needs a slight sizing adjustment." He looked up at me then, his serious tone softening. "Can we test it tomorrow?" "We'll see," I said, ruffling his hair. "There's still a safety checklist to finish." He sighed, mock dramatic. "The waiting is the worst part." I laughed, sitting beside him. "You're 9. You're allowed to wait." He opened a drawer and pulled out the envelope I had given him that morning, sealed and marked with today's date. "Margaret's final gift." "You think I should open it now?" he asked. I nodded. "She wrote it just for you." Benji carefully peeled the seal and unfolded the letter. I watched his eyes scan the words slowly, then pause. "She said I have your heart," he whispered. I blinked fast, smiling through the ache in my chest. "You do." "And his mind," he added quieter. I hesitated. "Yes." He was silent for a moment. "But I don't have to be like him." "No," I said. "You don't." Then he pulled something else out of the envelope. A key, small, silver, attached to a tag. "What's this?" "A safety deposit box," I said softly. "She left it in your name. It's yours when you turn 18. He nodded, turning the key in his hand like it was already a piece of his future. That night, after we locked up the lab and turned off the monitors, we walked past the darkened surgical suites, down the corridor that had once been just a dream carved out of grief and determination. Benji reached up and held my hand. "Mom?" "Yeah? Do you think he'll try to come back?" I paused. "He might," I said honestly. "But that doesn't mean you have to let him in." He didn't respond right away, just walked a little further, his sneakers quiet against the tile floor. "I don't think I need him," he said finally. "You stayed." My throat closed and I squeezed his hand. "Always." Weeks later, the first patient received Benji's valve. She was 5 days old, born with a rare defect, fragile, pale, fading fast. I performed the surgery myself. It was successful. When I emerged from the OR, I found Benji waiting in the hallway, dressed in his tiny lab coat, feet swinging from the bench. "Did it work?" he asked. "It did," I said. "She's stable. You saved her." He smiled, then stood and wrapped his arms around me, burying his face in my side. "I didn't just save her," he whispered. "You did. You saved me first." And in that moment, with the world quiet around us and a newborn heartbeat steady behind a glass wall, I realized what Margaret had always meant. Legacy wasn't what we left behind in our names. It was what we built in others, one act of love at a time. Benji and I stood there, mother and son, healer and inventor. Not because we needed redemption, but because we had already made something greater. We had made it real. And nothing James had lost could ever measure up to what we had found. Thank you so much for staying with us all the way to the end of this powerful story. Claire and Benji's journey reminds us of something deeply important in life. Sometimes the people who walk away from us are actually giving us the space to become who we're meant to be. Through betrayal, heartbreak, and loss, Claire found strength she didn't know she had, and in doing so, she gave her son a legacy not of wealth or status, but of love, perseverance, and quiet dignity. This story isn't just about medicine or motherhood. It's about choosing to rise, even when the world expects you to fall. Now we want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? What part of this story moved you the most? If you believe in stories that uplift, heal, and inspire, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a moment. We have many more real, emotional, and unforgettable stories to share with you. Until next time, take care of your heart and always stand tall in your truth.